Welcome to this Intelligent Business webinar hosted by SRM. My name is Markus Korhonen, and I'm a Senior Associate in SRM's Strategic Intelligence Practice. Just as an introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with SRM, we're a global risk and intelligence consultancy, and we support our clients across a wide range of corporate intelligence services and cybersecurity. As a bit of background to this discussion, alongside my colleagues joining me today, I had the pleasure of working on SRM's recently published Intelligent Business 2022 Strategic Intelligence Report. You can freely download the reports on our website. In the report, we surveyed more than 200 users and consumers of strategic intelligence across a range of US and UK firms with revenues of more than 250 million USD. And we asked them about how they view the discipline, what matters most to them when it comes to strategic intelligence outputs, and what changes they're seeing in the field. The report also drew on insights from intelligence specialists working in three major global companies, namely Cheryl Steele, who's a CSO at Starbucks, Gary Petrea, the Vice President for Global Security and Resilience at Levi Strauss, and Jerry Kroll, the Chief Risk, Ethics and Compliance Officer at Brown-Forman Corporation. We're going to touch on some of the key findings and insights from this research through the webinar. And I'd also like to say that we encourage audience members to submit questions via the Q&A function at the top of your screens. And please also make a note if you'd like to hear from a particular panelist. Otherwise, just send the questions as they are, and we can address them as a collective. We'll make sure to leave time at the end for your questions and comments, so please do make use of this option. Joining me today are three of my colleagues from SRM. First, we have Martin Devenish. Martin is a board director and the head of corporate intelligence at SRM. Prior to joining the company, Martin spent 22 years at Goldman Sachs in London and New York. And during his career, Martin assumed a number of leadership roles and became a partner in 2002. From 2005 to 2011, he was head of equities for Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and for the following 2 years as an advisory director to Goldman Sachs with a focus on growth and frontier markets in that region. Martin, welcome.
Markus, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and thanks for joining.
We also have Sam Taylor. Sam is the head of corporate intelligence for the Americas. Sam has led and managed complex internal and external investigations, as well as supported clients in contentious litigation across several fields, including money laundering, counterfeit goods, intellectual property fraud, international asset traces, employee misconduct, and bribery issues. He co-led several monitorships in the public and private sectors and has significant experience in defending clients subject to hostile takeovers or proxy fights. He also supports clients with due diligence on large cross-border transactions. Sam began his career in finance before joining Kroll, where he ultimately led the firm's North American research practice. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Markus. Great to be with you.
And last but not least, we've got Gabrielle Reid. Gabby has over 10 years in the industry and has worked closely with our clients to develop tailored solutions that map their precise requirements for intelligence and analysis based on their locations, exposure, and objectives, analyzing changing geopolitical, security, and regulatory landscapes to better inform decision-making. Prior to joining SRM, she worked for a travel risk advisory firm and assisted in the planning and coordination of non-medical evacuations. Gabby is also an enterprise risk management certified professional. Hi, Gabby.
Thanks, Markus. It's great to be here.
In this webinar, I'm hoping we'll be able to draw out three key themes that we developed in our report. First, answering the question about the value that strategic intelligence brings. Second, we'll look at what differentiates good from bad intelligence. And last, we'll discuss what advantages organizations can gain by working with their intelligence providers, whether those are internal or external, as partners rather than just service providers. So let's start today's conversation with a central question. What do we actually mean when we speak about strategic intelligence? In the 2022 Strategic Intelligence Report, which I mentioned, we refer to it as the timely, relevant, accurate, and actionable insights an organization uses to identify, respond to, or even anticipate external risks and opportunities pertinent to their sector and jurisdictions. Now, that's quite a broad definition, but it's purposely so. And I think crucially, it speaks to the idea of not only anticipating and responding to risks, but also to identifying opportunities. Martin, I'd like to open by asking you about whether you've perceived in your conversations with clients, for example, a shift in how intelligence is seen not so much as a function that serves to put on the brakes to avoid risky situations, but actually as a business enabler.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Markus. And again, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining. I think it's probably worth clarifying up front that what we're not talking about here is an entirely new field of intelligence. In fact, what we are seeing is many of the skills that in the past would perhaps have sat in a traditional security risk team now being deployed more broadly. There's an increasing recognition that the skill sets that have sat in those teams, so things like triangulation of information, scenario planning, and consequence planning around those scenarios, how those can benefit the broader corporate organization. That recognition of those skills has also had another big driver, which is the explosion in information that's available online and data that's available online. Now, the sheer scale of that data can itself be a challenge, but if you're able to disseminate and make sense of that, and crucially, the information that's most relevant to you, and do that at speed, then you're going to find yourself with a higher degree of preparedness and potentially at an advantage to some of your competitors. Open source intelligence, or OSINT, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows it as the acronym, and the growth in available data has, in my opinion, been the major driver to the commercialization of what traditionally was that intelligence function that sat in the security risk team. So back to your question, and around whether that business intelligence, or whether intelligence has been a business enabler or a business blocker. I would argue that for the more enlightened organizations, it's always been viewed as an enabler. You know, the goal of intelligence is to help the company understand, and if I were to put my old banker hat on, price risk as accurately as it can. That process, of course, could result in a decision not to proceed with the transaction, or, to your point, be viewed as a block to a partnership or an investment or a hire. But the point there is, there's a reason for that. The process has determined that the price of that risk outweighs the potential return from that investment. But it's blocked for a reason. Now, again, I would argue that actually being a business enabler sometimes is staying out of trouble. And so those decisions not to proceed with something, if you believe that you've done your work and you've priced that appropriately, is just as much a business enabler in finding those new opportunities. But you can, of course, play the polar opposite to that. If through that strategic intelligence, you find that you believe you are able to price risk, to assess the risk more appropriately, that has the potential to open up opportunities to you as a business that others who haven't been through the process that you've been through may be too conservative on. They may have mispriced that risk. And so in those scenarios, it's absolutely the case that, good business intelligence is absolutely becoming a fundamental building block in the whole area of business planning. Of course, OSINT is deployed every day, and it's not just in those strategic decisions. Many people on this webinar will have seen the shift in the corporate intelligence business. An industry that we sit in, from one that traditionally heavily relied on networks and human source and getting on the ground and having those conversations. And of course, I'm not here saying that human doesn't have its value. It absolutely does have its value. But the speed with which industry moves, the speed with which information travels, has only accentuated the importance of timeliness. So yes, relevance, but also timeliness. And timeliness is a big part of relevance. And that has grown. That importance has grown significantly. We've all seen reputations be damaged in super quick time. And if you're not ahead in an event or a story, you are at risk of such damage. Alongside that is a requirement for ongoing monitoring. There's the initial work that you do, but then situations don't remain static forever. And of course, when you get into the world of monitoring, you need to make that as real time as you possibly can. Maybe to give an example, we work with, there's a large global tech company that we work with and support in a number of areas for them, but in particular right now in Latin America. And we provide them with monthly briefs, which are looking at medium, long-term shifts in sentiment and in particular in regulation. Around areas that are impacting them. So, they're a tech company. So areas around things like fake news and monitoring situations around fake news. Now, we're doing that in Latin America. As many on here will know, there's already been a number of elections in Latin America already this year, and there's one or two pretty significant ones to come. And so that monitoring is, yes, what's the direction of travel here, but also what's happening in the right here and now, because that, as we know, fake news around elections can be a pretty powerful weapon. And so that's an example of how we work with our clients right now.
Yeah, with the Latin American example that you mentioned there, Martin, as well as in some of our other engagements, what we've heard from clients is that this adds real value whether they have an existing internal intelligence function themselves or not. With all the information that's out there, it really is about getting to that specificity and sorting through all the available information and drawing out the meaning for their particular operations. We're going to look at this a little bit later on, but for me, that's really getting at the crux of private sector intelligence. And it's an interesting point you made there, Martin, about intelligence plugging into a variety of organizational requirements. This was something that that was borne out in the survey findings in our report, where there was a fairly even split in terms of whether intelligence served more to support strategic or more to support operational decisions. Now, particularly senior leadership saw this as equally important for both, which was quite an interesting finding to see. The idea that intelligence can assist at all levels and for a variety of decisions, I think shows why it makes sense to adopt quite a broad definition for what strategic intelligence is. Staying with the definition uses of strategic intelligence for a moment, Gabby, if I could bring you in here to consider this in slightly more practical terms. If we look at a situation like the breakout of the war in Ukraine, how do you see from a real world point of view the notion of actionable insights that we include in our understanding of the concept?
Thank you, Markus. I think the reference to actionable insights really speaks to the importance of forward-looking analysis. So to Martin's point earlier, one of the advantages in using strategic intelligence is that it allows for planning. And this is what we saw with engagements with our clients in the weeks prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So rather than getting caught up in prediction or the will he, won't he invade debate, our clients saw more value in understanding what the situation could look like, and more importantly, what they would need to consider, both at a strategic and also at an operational level, to best prepare for that situation. And often this sort of scenario mapping is really useful in identifying a business's blind spots or for identifying flag posts along a particular trajectory that are, of course, business relevant and are useful in tracking the important but often more subtle changes in an external environment. And so thinking about those first weeks, back in January and February this year, in one particular client engagement that comes to mind, we actually worked to develop a very structured and methodology-based approach to digest the, quite frankly, streams of information that was coming out from both Ukraine and Russia watchers at the time. And the aim of this approach was to be proactive and not simply focus on incident monitoring. So rather what we look to do is establish what we would frame a regular intelligence report that allowed for the identification and monitoring of slightly longer trends, and then, of course, shifts within these trends. And this allowed us to read whether or not the needle was moving, and, of course, what we could anticipate the impact of that move to be. So we developed early warning triggers that would inform our client of any escalation intentions between Ukraine and Russia. And specifically, we assessed these triggers in terms of consequences that were relevant to them. So safety to personnel, cyber considerations, as well as sanction risks. And our ongoing analysis in those early weeks of these triggers then fed directly into our clients' crisis management posture and allowed them to develop the appropriate responses. So, for example, staff evacuations to any notable deteriorations in the operating environment. And since then, I think, now post the actual invasion, we've since developed a range of monitoring products that are designed to read the temperature on any associated geopolitical shifts across the globe. And this could be anything from developments quite close to the actual conflict, so what's happening with the Baltic states, for example, to looking at the bigger picture and tracking emerging drivers of social unrest, for example, that are starting to emerge from the disruption to global wheat supplies. So what we're really looking to do is help our clients look over the horizon and identify the next possible hotspot for them.
Yeah, I think that's a key aspect of intelligence that you raised there, Gabby, in terms of being able to keep an eye on changes in the external environment or those shifts in trends. And the examples that you just discussed show, I think, how one of the key functions that we aim for as intelligence practitioners relates again to the difference between information and sometimes information overload in the example that you discussed, and intelligence. And that leads quite nicely to the next theme that we're covering in the webinar, and that's of good versus bad intelligence. One of the things that we started seeing very early on in the pandemic was an evolution in our intelligence outputs, driven very much by the types of questions that our clients were asking. I think it was understandable, given the uncertainties that were surrounding so many aspects of COVID-19 globally, that early on in the pandemic, a lot of client questions and therefore intelligence outputs were reactive, looking at constantly changing factors like case numbers, changing travel advisories, restrictions of movement, and so on. At the practitioner level, Gabby, did you see that approach change?
Well, I mean, reactive reporting can have value, but it's difficult to track a lot of these variables in a timely fashion. And this can often lead to analysis that's quite simply just a step behind. So I remember those early days, no sooner had we reported on the latest travel advisories than those advisories had changed. And so the value of our intelligence was lower. Real-time reporting is important, but it's not necessarily what I would frame to be the primary purpose of strategic intelligence. We're trying to achieve something slightly different here. Strategic intelligence really aims to support intelligence-driven decision-making. And almost by definition, if you think about that, it would require forward-looking and a sort of a broader perspective. So some of the key issues that, if we take this back to the report, respondents to our survey noted is when looking at the intelligence they receive, more often than not, it takes too much time to digest, or it's not tailored to their specific business needs, and that it's simply too much information to make useful sense of it. And Cheryl Steele, the CSO from Starbucks, who, as you mentioned, Markus, kindly gave SRM an in-depth interview for the report, really said it best. And I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but for this type of intelligence, and obviously there's multiple types of intelligence out there, but for this type of intelligence support to be of greatest value to a client or a company, it needs to be aligned to the business of the business. And this really means it can be a business enabler, even, or I'd go as far as saying, especially during these uncertain times. So taking it back to the pandemic, as the COVID-19 pandemic progressed, we really saw an evolution in the types of concerns or questions that our clients had. And consequently, we had to see an evolution in the types of intelligence support that they required. So increasingly, we moved away from a type of reactive reporting. We had to zoom out, look at that bigger picture. And importantly, by focusing on what this all meant for each client and recognizing the differences within that, we began to look at the strategic level implications of the pandemic. And this really was quite wide-ranging, For example, at one point, we looked at, vaccination development and the planned rollouts, not only looking at the approach to vaccine dissemination in our clients' key markets or tracking the latest advisories that were being released by international bodies at the time, but interlinking this with political, security, operational considerations so that we could really assess the realities of vaccine dissemination across different jurisdictions. I think we also looked at the time at vaccine mandates and related labor pressure points along supply chains, looking at the impacts of sectoral labor availability. Could we anticipate where vaccine hesitancy could manifest and possibly impact labor supply, as well as sort of wider supply chain disruptions too? So I think with those examples, you can start to see that we moved away from your high-level reactive or tier one analysis. So, looking at the question, how do I respond to the pandemic today? And we moved into tier two, tier three considerations. And I say this led us to develop some very creative outputs for clients who, already in those early stages, were starting to look through the pandemic and even to the post-pandemic context. But what I would add is that it need not be only in response to a major geopolitical shift in the landscape, such as COVID-19, or even, referencing the current conflict in Ukraine, or the ramifications for global oil prices and commodity supplies. We've seen the value in forward-looking and more strategic level intelligence on a range of perhaps slower moving shifts. So, for example, ESG concerns, such as regulations in single-use plastics, for example, or the variance in a government's approach to forest risk commodities and the reputational consequences that can come out of that. But yeah, of course, the pandemic was a major accelerator in businesses thinking about strategic implications of geopolitical developments.
Gabby, I think you raised some really interesting points, particularly in regard to understanding the business of the business. What the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has shown us was that different types of intelligence can be good at different times and to address different types of questions in line with our clients' needs and evolving objectives. You'll see in our report that responses to our survey showed that what intelligence consumers value the most are the relevance, accuracy, and timeliness of intelligence. You won't always be able to satisfy these three needs of your client unless you actually know that client very well. So the first step is of course, to always listen to your client and to spend the time to understand the operational needs that they have and the risks that their business faces. The better you know your client, of course, the better you'll be at understanding and answering their questions and anticipating their future needs, which is, I think, critical to and key and central to strategic intelligence. The most relevant intelligence is, of course, tailored and is a function of those needs. As you'll see in our report, respondents to our survey stated that the most preferred way they'd like to receive strategic intelligence is in a tailored report with customized analysis. And you won't be surprised to find that one of the biggest complaints survey respondents had with intelligence reporting is that it isn't relevant to the needs of their business. This was particularly evident during the height of the pandemic. As the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic changed, and as our clients were adjusting to their postures in regard to changing government mandates, as well as the needs and desires of their employees, their supply chain issues, changes in customer demand, we predicted and observed that their intelligence needs would also change. And specifically, that intelligence needed to be relevant to each particular business, whether they be supply chain reliant or human capital intensive businesses. This often meant looking at workforce and employee issues. To Gabby's point, our work is so much better informed and our clients better served when we understand the business of the business. Now, of course, this required us to be proactive in identifying trends, making a calculated and thorough analysis, and relaying that information to our clients in a timely manner. In some cases, it affirmed what clients themselves were predicting, but in others, we contradicted their own findings. And we found in that latter situation was where we were able to provide the most value. It's not always a message that clients want to hear, but our role as intelligent professionals is to go where the facts tell us within the context of our client's business. Finally, I think the format in which that intelligence is reported to our clients is equally critical. They want reporting that's proactive, timely, and relevant to their organizational needs, but it needs to be in an easily consumable form. That means that the intelligence and analysis needs to cut through the noise and get straight to the point. Clients aren't looking for a peer-reviewed study, but a concise and well-informed brief by someone knowledgeable about the field who can quickly get to the point about what the intelligence identified means for that client's business so that it's actionable. This should be in the form of a detailed and concise report with all of the kind of extraneous bits removed. And I'd also say, a verbal briefing doesn't hurt either. If the value is to be delivered, if the message to be delivered is urgent, then I think that's probably the best way to get in front of the right intelligence consumer quickly. I think professionals in our field are often partial to demonstrating their knowledge and their analysis of the facts, which of course is critical. But I think keeping in mind the client, their business, and the time that they have to digest the end product is equally, if not more important.
Thanks, Sam. I thought it was quite interesting that you both spoke about different types of intelligence being good at different times in the pandemic, whether that's more incident driven or more forward looking. But either way you look at it, and whatever the particular output is that we might deliver to clients at a given time, it's quite apparent that the demand for private sector intelligence is there, and it seems like that demand is only going to grow. Something that our survey results showed quite overwhelmingly was that the many different forms of intelligence are increasingly valued. 80% of respondents said that their firms needed to actually invest more in these types of services, and 88% said that strategic intelligence is an important factor in the overall success of their company. At the same time, as you'll see on the slide there, only 20% of respondents said they exclusively or predominantly rely on internal sources for intelligence, and there are a number of reasons for that. But to me, that speaks to the real value that organizations can draw from developing a close relationship with their intelligence providers. And it also puts an expectation on those intelligence providers then to make sure that they really do understand the client. And I think that brings us quite nicely to the third area that we're gonna speak about today, and that's related to the value of partnerships. Sporadic engagements with intelligence providers can be perfectly appropriate at times, of course, but the downside is that they can lead to that reactive support or reactive intelligence outputs that you referenced earlier, Gabby, rather than building what you might think about as a longer-term strategic outlook. Martin, I wonder if you would be happy to speak here about what you see as some of the key advantages of adopting what we refer to as a partnership model with your intelligence provider.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it, as you say, Markus, there are clearly going to be many areas where the traditional client-vendor relationship is perfectly fine. Be it a simple one-off task, or where perhaps for confidentiality reasons, there's only so much that a vendor can know. But when it comes to, something that Gabby's mentioned and we've talked a little bit about already, when it comes to horizon scanning, or as I think one of our contributors said in the report, trying to look around the corner, relevance is super important. In any horizon scanning, there's going to be more variables involved. There's going to be more potential threats than actual threats. And it's those, to quote a famous quote, it's those unknown unknowns that you're trying to spot as soon as they start to develop. To be able to identify those, and importantly, those whose consequences have the potential to have a pretty significant impact on your client, you, or us, I should say, as the vendor, really need to have an appreciation of what the business drivers are for that client's business. And not only the business drivers, but what are the sensitivities and which ones are going to have the biggest impact? Because there's often a scale for that in terms of where you need to look first and what you need to address. Now, that appreciation is only going to come from as transparent a relationship and as transparent a dialogue as you can. to be fair here, the onus is on the client if they wish to have that relationship to them to open up. We can't force the client to open up, and so it's really their responsibility if they genuinely want to get proper benefit from that forward-look intelligence. The onus is on them to develop a relationship with the vendor to the point where they feel trusting enough to share some of those key core components of what drives the business. And if they don't, they've got to recognize there's a trade-off, and it does become more reactionary rather than forward look. And as we've said, there's some value in that. Don't want to dismiss that completely, but it prevents you from getting into that sort of strategy side and that business planning. It's an obvious thing to say, but the best relationships that we have with our clients are built on trust. That takes time, but without that, you're never going to get to that transparent dialogue. I think it's also worth pointing out for those people who have dialed in here who are, would be our points of contact within companies. You've got to have that relationship first before we can have that relationship. And so I think within companies, where it works best for us and in turn with the in-house strategic intelligence team is when that team is very close to the core decision makers. And so, the first buy-in to some extent, it needs to be at the recognition of these skills and the talent and the insight that sits within these teams by the decision makers, the core decision makers, the C-suite, and whoever else is involved within the corporates. Because without that, there's not a lot we can do. But it really is about, trying to identify the needs, trying to anticipate the needs, to be attuned to the business's objectives, and where we can, to be attuned to their risk appetite. Now, at the end of the day, the risk decision still lives with the end client. But our job is to make them as informed as possible, and where we can, give advice on some of the scenarios and the impact likely. But ultimately, it's their decision. But if we can be, in touch with where their risk tolerance sits on different aspects, then again, that allows us to do our job much more effectively. And it also helps us understand what are the real questions that need answering. And all of this comes back to this relevance and timeliness. If you know what the right questions are, what you're going to dig up and what you're going to provide is likely to be more relevant. And you're also going to not waste a lot of time looking at stuff which ultimately is irrelevant to that client you're talking to.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point you raise there, Martin, about the onus being on the client to let their intelligence provider in if that partnership model is really going to bear fruit. And I suppose it also speaks to the recognition of intelligence providers as delivering an important service, something I alluded to with reference to the survey results earlier. What I think we've seen in our work is that the willingness to engage in this way does vary. It varies client to client, of course, but also perhaps a little bit market to market. Sam, you're based in the US, where some might argue there's a slightly more developed market in terms of private sector intelligence. Have you seen in client engagements that this notion of partnership is becoming entrenched in how businesses approach intelligence providers?
It's a good question, Markus. I think the answer is it's mixed. And I think some of this goes back to Martin's point about the balance between the vendor and the client, and on each side understanding each other. It's on us. The onus is on us as the vendor and the intelligence professional to be able to explain to the client what services we can provide and what we can do. But it's also on the client to recognize what that is and to be able to exploit it beyond whatever their core competency is. So you'll see in our intelligent business report, Brown-Forman's Jerry Kroll notes that strategic intelligence is not a part of his company's core competence. It's not what they do as a company, and this is why they seek external support. But because intelligence is about finding those issues that impact their business, Jerry wants to know that the intelligence he receives is put into the right context and immediately actionable. For this to work, a partner that understands the business is vital. The lack of internal expertise was listed by respondents in our survey as the top reason why they rely on external sources for their intelligence needs. And this was followed closely by the need for higher quality analysis than a client can produce internally. Of course, in addition to that, they desired an independent perspective, and that's, I think, as well where we can come in and supplement whatever an internal intelligence team does. So all these points speak to the notion of having a trusted partner in the intelligence space, someone who you can send bespoke requests and questions to, and whom you can task with certain projects. And as back to, I think, our earlier point in this webinar, someone who knows your business and will deliver to you that customized and relevant reporting that we touched on earlier. I'd also note that some of our clients, just to what I was saying earlier, have a mix in terms of a range of their complexity. So some have very mature internal intelligence organizations, while others are still being built out. And our clients will leverage us for specific and targeted assignments. Those with the minimal internal intelligence programs rely on us quite heavily, whereas those that are more complex are going to be more on those bespoke targeted tasks. And the immature programs, in those instances, will often be, in fact, filling analyst positions for them, serving as a supplemental aspect to their internal team. So I think in either instance, it's a partnership, given how closely you need to understand the client's environment and to be able to provide actionable intelligence. But some of these partnerships are going to be more entrenched than others.
Yeah, I would agree with Sam on that. I think, we can add that value in terms of expertise, capacity, and independence. But where we've seen the most success in providing valuable insights to our clients has been where we worked in an integrated manner. Intelligence just cannot exist in a silo, and it needs to be digestible and it needs to be useful for our clients. So we've had the most successful outcomes when we've been able to have almost an ongoing conversation with our clients. And I suppose taking it back to, internal intelligence teams, this would be a dialogue with their internal stakeholders or their internal clients, so to speak. So our intelligence outputs need to be useful to and align with their objectives, those stakeholders' objectives, be it to paint a picture of the risks or indeed highlight possible opportunities, which Martin touched on at the start. And unfortunately, at times, this can mean going back to the drawing board when at that conceptualization phase to really make sure that, the output that we're designing is of use to that client.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby, and thanks, Sam. I'm aware that we've all been speaking for a fairly long time now. So at this point, I would like to open the conversation up and take some of the questions that you have been posting on the Q&A function. I'll keep an eye on that. So if you haven't done so and would like to, please do post your questions there. We've had a few come in already, so I'll start with those. So the first question here is, to what extent can technology assist or even replace human intelligence analysis? Gabby, shall I send that your way?
Sure. Well, hopefully it never completely replaces it, otherwise we'd all be out of a job. But no, I think in all seriousness, technology is an enabler, right? It can help us expand our information sources. It can build in efficiencies into our collection and processing of information. It can improve our analysis and evolve the way we convey or share our intelligence findings. So it really does have an important role to play in this space. As it stands, though, from our perspective, I'd say, there is still a huge value in the human factor, particularly when looking at tailored and relevant intelligence outputs, the themes that have been peppered through the conversation today. As we've referenced, the ability to have that conversation between the intelligence producer and the intelligence consumer is vital. Needs evolve, priorities change. And I'm not convinced that technology in the sector as yet is at the level where it's going to, respond to that without human input. We definitely should be using technology to do our jobs better. What the role of technology will look like, further along the line is still to be seen. If I was a betting person, I'd say, though, that there's going to be a balance of some sort particular providers will do certain things well because of technology, and certain providers will do other things well because of their human aspect. And ultimately what that means for the consumer, hopefully, is that it'll be the best of both worlds.
Okay, thanks. We've got another question here. The speakers mentioned helping clients look over the horizon and identifying or considering the next possible hotspot, disruptor, or opportunity. Are there any developments or trends in particular that you are currently watching very closely? Martin, you want to have a go at that?
I'll give it a go, yeah. I mean, I think the short answer, there's a lot. And, you know, and again, you know, with not wishing to be too generic, because the whole point of this obviously is not everything's relevant to every one of our clients. But I, you know, I mean, I think we just take a few lessons. I mean, I do think, partly following on from Gabby's point, I think if anything, you know, what we've all learned over the last 6 months, maybe a little bit longer, to be fair, pre-pandemic or during the pandemic as well. You know, there was a book that was written a good few years ago called "The World Is Flat" by a guy called Thomas Friedman, who's an author, writer, US. And it was essentially saying, you know, effectively, you know, you wake up one day and actually, you know, you can have businesses in India, even though you're, you know, ultimately selling in the States or call center, whatever, and doing business everywhere looks a lot like doing business down the road. Well, I think we've all learned that that's not true. And, you know, we've learned it's not true, you know, partly because of the challenges of the supply chain during the pandemic. But I also think, you know, the trend of globalization dismissed too easily and too readily cultural differences. And I think they're coming back to the fore. And so I do think, and maybe we're talking our own book here, but I do think there's a resurgence in the intelligence industry. And, you know, you can look at it as you know, some of it will be that traditional geopolitical sort of research, because the differences are bigger than we thought. And that lesson's been learned very harshly over the last 2 to 3 years. So I think generally the backdrop is there's a lot more horizon scanning. I mean, if we were going to look specifically, and if I was going to take a guess, I think, you know, obviously you've got the tragedy that is the war in Ukraine. You've got ongoing lockdowns in China, as you know, which is a different strategy to the pandemic or coming out of the pandemic that a number of countries have had. But all of that is accentuating the supply chain. So, you know, do I believe everyone's supply chain is going to come back to being down the road? No, I don't. I think there are other dynamics that will prevent that. But there's obviously a shift in supply chain, and there's a greater awareness of things that can impact your ability to get your widgets to the production line, wherever that is. And so there's a much more scrutiny on that. I'll tell you the one thing I think that is also coming back. It's going to be interesting to watch, and Gabby touched on this with regards to wheat. I think social unrest, unfortunately, is something that corporates are going to have to pay a lot more attention to. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, there's the extreme of sort of disruption of unrest, which is the war. But if you look at what's happening, fuel prices, global inflation, food, and, you know, we've got an example right here, right now in Sri Lanka. You know, you think back a little while, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, you know, would we have thought this was going on in Sri Lanka? Well, there's a bunch of companies that, you know, that have exposure there. And so I think we're going to start to see that pocket of social unrest in different countries become more and more prevalent. So monitoring that sentiment, social media, that sort of stuff is one. And then the other thing, which we won't get into here because it's a pretty big topic, but the S is part of it. I mean, clearly there are, you know, ESG is something now that people need to pay a lot more attention, and rightly are paying a lot more attention to. We're doing a lot of work. Gabby mentioned the example of single-use plastics earlier. You know, we're doing a lot of work on the E, the S, and the G. But as I say, I think that S is important because I think the ramifications of social disruption can be pretty significant, as we're seeing right now.
And I just, you know, come in there to add to that. I think something that will be critical to understand is the interlinkage between these geopolitical pressures and pre-existing domestic factors in a particular jurisdiction. You know, Martin referenced Sri Lanka there. That's a combination of both. There were inherent domestic factors that were present, there are geopolitical pressures that are playing out, and we're seeing the consequences of that. It's going to become increasingly important to weigh up how geopolitical, regional, and domestic pressures play out in different markets, because we don't want to be in a position where, geopolitical drivers result in anticipating these types of manifestations equally in every market. We need to understand the specifics of each market too, or each jurisdiction. So something that will be increasingly critical for businesses to understand is, how do geopolitical factors impact the domestic factors? How do the pre-existing domestic factors respond to those geopolitical pressures, and what are the manifestations of that in that particular country? I think that'll be really interesting and really relevant for businesses, particularly those who have quite a widespread global footprint as well.
Yeah, I think we've got one more question come in. You mentioned forward-looking of a broader perspective, but tailored to specific business needs. Does this include commodities? And do you have specialists in the PGMs, for example? And if so, what type of reports can you prepare for the client? Any takers on that?
I don't think we have specialists in PGMs, which I assume is platinum group metals. But, in terms of, do we have experience and do we work with commodities companies? I mean, metals mining companies, yes. Oil and gas companies, yes. Does that involve looking at some of the provenance of those metals, looking at the global industry in terms of, particularly when you look at some of these metals, when you look at, the regulation around trade controls, I mean, there's a whole lithium war going on. I use that term advisedly. I mean, at the moment, and so there's a lot of pressure on certain countries and industries in terms of the degree to which they export or not export. And I think, with the headlong rush to zero carbon and EVs and all that sort of stuff, I can see the pressure on those only going one way. And so again, in terms of in terms of an explicit answer to the question, do we have PGM experts? No. Do we have experience of looking at how regulation, how trade tensions, how social issues can impact the availability, the supply, the demand, the control thereof of that trade? Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a monitoring that looks at all of that stuff. And so it's a question of deploying stuff I referred to earlier, taking those open source intelligence skills and just pointing it at another asset or another industry and seeing what you can find out. And to Gabby's point, a lot of the projects are bespoke in nature. So it's an iterative process with the client. So the client like this will come, whoever asked the question, thank you for the question, will come to us and say, right, this is what I'm trying to answer. How would you help? And then it will be, okay, this is what we think we could do. This is what's available. This is how we'd monitor it. This is the initial, and then it's that back and forth. And that gets to the very point about, what doesn't work is that generic, give me an industry study on PGMs. Tell me which of the producers in which jurisdictions are really going to impact that market, and potential supply disruption and what have you. So no to specialists, but yes, I'm sure we can help.
Okay, thanks very much. We haven't had any more questions come in, so I think we can wrap this up a little bit early. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to all the panelists for their time and insights, and also to the audience for their questions. If you'd like to get in touch with any of us at SRM, please do reach out. I'd also like to remind you that our 2022 Strategic Intelligence Report is available to download for free on the SRM website, srminform.com. Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists.